Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Ankit Panda's new book delivers a stark message. We've entered a new nuclear age. This one is shaped by rising U.S.-Russia tensions, China's emergence as a major nuclear power, and a wave of tech breakthroughs, including AI, that are transforming the nuclear landscape. The result? A world where nuclear security is more complicated and more dangerous than ever. In The New Nuclear Age at the Precipice of Armageddon, Panda breaks down the key trends driving this shift. In our conversation, he explains why this moment is so perilous and how we might avoid stumbling into a new nuclear war. As I mentioned throughout this interview, Ankit Panda's book is really an excellent entry point into understanding the state of play of nuclear weapons today. And we recorded our conversation live at the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference in mid-April. More conversations from this conference are coming soon, and I hope you'll enjoy this series on nuclear security. All right, now here is my conversation with Ankit Panda, author of the new book, The New Nuclear Age at the Precipice of Armageddon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg, and I am coming to you live from the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference. Welcome, everyone. I am joined today by Ankit Panda, author of the new book, The New Nuclear Age at the Precipice of Armageddon. And I say new book, but it's not even out yet, is it?
It just came out a couple weeks ago.
Oh, it did? Okay,
Yeah.
Good. Well, it is great. You know, I read about half of it on the flight over on my way here. And for a book about such a heavy topic, it's like a breezy read.
I'm really glad to hear that.
It's really good. And I strongly recommend it. So you call your book The New Nuclear Age, and we're going to spend the bulk of our conversation discussing why that is. Before we get there, though, can I have you walk viewers and listeners through what were the previous nuclear eras?
I think that's exactly the right place to start, right? Because to understand why things are new this time, you have to understand where we're coming from. So broadly speaking, some people dispute the idea that it's even meaningful to separate what we call the broader nuclear age that began in 1945 into these distinct periods. I think it still is useful, right? We have the Cold War period, which is when we discover nuclear strategy, arms control, the role that nuclear weapons play, what Bernard Brodie calls the absolute weapon, nuclear weapons fundamentally changing the entire enterprise of warfare for the countries that possess these capabilities. And this is the moment when that word Armageddon that appears in the title of my book really manifests in a visceral way, right? We have tens of thousands of nuclear weapons that legitimately could have ended life on Earth had they all been used. And the vast majority of those weapons were possessed by the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War ends, thankfully, and the shadow that nuclear weapons cast over the world recedes. It doesn't go away. Nuclear weapons remain among the capabilities that countries continue to prize. But as nuclear weapons recede, as the United States and the newly founded Russian Federation engage in arms control efforts, the number of weapons goes down. We undertake efforts to build up a global nuclear order that's a lot more durable. We extend the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Weapons, for instance, which is the most durable arms control agreement, in my opinion, a really important treaty that prevents the spread of these weapons and allows for the spread of peaceful nuclear energy. And this brings us to the new nuclear age.
I just want to emphasize that brief kind of receding of nuclear threats from the precipice that it was during the Cold Cold War because of the advent of so many of these nuclear arms control agreements from the CTBO, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. You referenced the additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It seems, just reading your book, I suppose I didn't quite appreciate how there was this singular era of international cooperation on nuclear policy, on nuclear weapons control. That seems, it wasn't like that long ago, but it seems like a bygone era.
Absolutely, right. The 90s are this incredible period of optimism where nuclear disarmament seems tractable, right? I talk about this in the book. I mean, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was indefinitely extended in 1995. This was not a treaty that, when it was negotiated, was meant to last forever. At least the parties that signed up couldn't have taken it for granted. And I would argue one of the big reasons we did manage to extend the NPT indefinitely, which, by the way, required the non-nuclear weapon states to agree that this treaty was worth preserving, was because disarmament did seem tractable, because the United States and the Soviet Union had pulled back thousands of weapons they deployed overseas. South Africa had disarmed at the end of the Cold War as well. And of course, by the early 2000s, you begin to see the signs of malaise that lead us to this third nuclear age that is, unfortunately, a lot more dangerous, where that optimism has, I think, given way to complexity, new dark clouds, new sources of pessimism about managing nuclear risks.
What was a source of that malaise?
So there's really multiple factors. The big one that I identify in the book is, I think, the return of fundamental geopolitical friction among the major powers, right? This was the bipolarity that characterized the Cold War, was, of course, a manifestation of the sharp geopolitical divisions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And nuclear risks were one manifestation of that fundamental political discord among the superpowers. Beginning in the 2010s, you begin to see the return of that between the United States and Russia, of course, with a very important third player this time, China. But you could go deeper still. You could talk about, of course, the United States taking certain steps in the early 2000s under the Bush administration to move away from certain arms control strictures. I talk about the end of the anti-ballistic missile treaty as one of the sources. I think I call it the original sin in many ways that leads us to this moment we're in today, where arms control agreements that were rather important in bounding the scope of nuclear dangers started to fray and dissipate. And so it's the arrival of China, it's the return of geopolitical friction between the three major powers, Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 being, I think, a very important turning point. But of course, you have new players as well. You have North Korea's arrival as a nuclear power in its own right by the end of the 2010s. North Korea has since matured quite a bit. You have new sources of technological flux. And all of this is meaningfully colliding in a way that I don't think we've seen previously. So there is something meaningfully unprecedented about this moment. And the fundamental argument in the book is that what makes this new nuclear age really, I think, come together is the fact that nuclear weapons, just in the way that they receded from the global consciousness after the end of the Cold War, are now very much back at the center of international politics in a way that they haven't been in a while.
Was there like a moment, an inflection point, a particular thing that happened that you would say points most distinctly between the previous era, that one in which the weapon threat was receding, to the one we're in now? I mean, your book, maybe I haven't gotten quite there in your book. I'm only halfway through. But is there like a singular thing that you could point to?
So there are, I could point to several singular things, I suppose. I mean, the big one, I think, for many people was, of course, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine backed by nuclear threats. I think for a lot of people, especially in the West, that was a moment that I think communicated that, first of all, conventional war in Europe was very much possible, because that's exactly what we've seen. But also, Russian President Vladimir Putin made, I don't think, a particularly strong attempt to be very subtle about the kinds of nuclear signaling he engaged in. And so I think it sparked global debates about nuclear proliferation, nuclear deterrence, what nuclear weapons can and cannot do, debates about why it might be a bad idea to put a no-fly zone over Ukraine, despite the fact that many of us in the West wanted to support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So nuclear deterrence bounds us in that way. And I think the Ukraine war was really a moment for a lot of us to fundamentally reinterrogate these questions. And in the course of researching the book, I had the opportunity to travel the world, to talk to officials, strategic elites in a variety of countries, both countries with nuclear weapons and countries without. And of course, the argument that we were entering a new nuclear age wasn't controversial in really any of these places. I think everybody understood that something had changed. It was the synthesis of why is this change happening now? And for that, I think we still do need to go back to that fundamental geopolitical discord between the major powers. I think that's really one of the key drivers.
So let's walk through like many of the elements that you identify and define as putting us in this new nuclear age. One of them, you just discussed, is this heightened competition and rivalry between the United States and Russia, exacerbated by the invasion of Ukraine. Another is China. How does China fit into this being a new nuclear era that distinguishes itself from previous eras?
Sure. So there has always been a way in which the competition in the realm of nuclear weaponry and nuclear deterrence has disproportionately circulated around the superpowers. Right, the United States and Russia used to possess almost all of the nuclear weapons of the world. I mean, I think it's fair to describe at one point in the Cold War, all of the nuclear weapons that existed outside of the United States and Russia as essentially being a rounding error compared to the total destructive power that those two countries could effectuate on each other. In the post-Cold War period, this largely remained true, even as the United States and Russia drew down the aggregate number of nuclear weapons that they deployed for domestic reasons, for arms control reasons. China was very interesting. China tested its first nuclear weapon in 1964 in October, and it chose to tolerate a remarkable level of vulnerability for a number of decades.
And by that, you mean just keeping a low level of nuclear weapons and not doing much to protect those nuclear weapons from potential attack.
Yeah, I mean, we could go into why, like, the intellectual origins of Chinese thinking about nuclear weaponry under Mao, but fundamentally, Mao was not interested in playing the game that the United States and the Soviet Union were playing. And this fundamentally, I think, came to characterize China's approach to nuclear affairs through the 1990s and into the 2000s and into the 2010s in many ways. China modernized, but in terms of numbers, China was very content to stay in what the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency in 2019 said was a force comprising warheads in the low 200s, right?
Like a minimal deterrent.
In a way.
Also, they uniquely pledged no first use as well, which you discuss in your book.
Yeah, that was the big innovation that China announced to the world in 1964. They announced it the day that they announced their first nuclear test. They said China would never be the first to use nuclear weapons. And they do continue to adhere to that policy publicly. But of course, what happens in 2021 on the front page of the Washington Post is we see images from Western China in the desert showing what appear to be hundreds of holes in the ground for ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads. A few months later, a second such site is found and a third such site is found. China is building 3 large fields for nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. And of course, since then, the United States has publicly assessed that China is in the course of a quantitative buildup that is unlike anything we've seen in its history. It is building up to potentially 1,500 nuclear warheads deployed by 2035. And of course, this is happening at precisely the moment when U.S.-China frictions are growing. The prospect of a conventional war between the two countries is rising. And so the question is why, on the one hand, which we don't have a very good answer to. There's a big debate. China has not publicly acknowledged this buildup. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has not given a speech saying why he feels that China needs more nuclear weapons or anything like that. But what it does do is it turns for the first time the relationships between the nuclear armed superpowers into a 3-way game. And we don't have a very good intellectual framework to think about what stability, what arms control look like in that universe.
It's just, I think, worth emphasizing how quickly this change happened. You just said in 2019, the U.S. government's estimates was around, in the low 200s or mid 200s. Like, a couple of years later, we're now talking about, thousands.
Well, we're not yet there. They're still building up. I mean, today I think China's around 500 to 600 warheads.
Okay,
so they
but
have
in the process, and like in like the with the intention of building many thousands.
Exactly.
So how does this 3-way game, as you describe it, like change how we think about nuclear weapons, and sort of why is it a definitive part of this era, this new era?
Sure. So the reasons for this, I think, really manifest in how the United States has thought about nuclear strategy questions for a number of years and the sufficiency of its own forces, right? The U.S. thinks very differently from other nuclear states. I mean, notably thinks very differently from what I would describe as the Chinese approach to nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. For the United States, the number of nuclear weapons really has been increased or decreased historically in relation to Russia.
Hmm.
Right, as a result of arms control, we have identified the principle of parity in terms of the size of our forces as being broadly stabilizing. So we've tried to keep pace with the Russians. We don't deploy the exact same kind of nuclear force the Russians do, nor should we. But the broad approach that the United States has maintained has really been fixated on this one country. The way in which the U.S. would talk about China, if you talk to people that would do nuclear planning in the military, was they would describe China as the so-called lesser included case. That's a bit of jargon, but basically what it means is that any nuclear force for a while that the United States could deploy that would solve its Russia related deterrence problems would do the same for China,
Hmm.
that you didn't have to have a China specific answer. Now, the concern in Washington, and I think this is a bipartisan concern, is that that may no longer be a
Mm.
usable rubric going forward, that the US might have to think about either increasing the number of nuclear weapons it deploys in a world where both Russia and China are presenting what you might call near peer threats to the United States. I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's just a description of
Yeah.
why there is this new anxiety. The other source of anxiety, of course, that I think manifests in a more global scale is that what we see today is fundamentally nuclear multipolarity of the kind that I don't think we've seen in the past, right? We've always had multiple countries with nuclear weapons, but like I said, the superpower dynamics manifested in what we call a dyad, right? It's a two-way competition. India and Pakistan were their own dyad, India and China were their own dyad. Today, I think the linkages between the various nuclear states are a lot more important to understanding global nuclear dynamics. You also have non-nuclear countries, technologically sophisticated countries, in many cases American allies, that can implicate the survivability of nuclear countries as they seek to carry out military operations.
Mm.
But also, I mean, the way in which the United States reacts to China is likely to provoke a counter reaction from China, which in turn is going to spike threat perceptions in India, which in turn is going to spike threat perceptions in Pakistan. And by the way, as the US does things to deter China militarily, it's going to spook the North Koreans and the Russians in East Asia as well. So you can just see why the
Yeah.
complexity that we're dealing with today is really distinct from what we've seen in the past. Again, without being ahistorical, because we've had multiple states, we have
Mhm.
had multipolarity in a weak sense. Today, I think the ways in which multipolar nuclear dynamics are manifesting and
Mhm.
multiplying are just very meaningfully different.
So you have increased rivalry competition with Russia. You have the addition of China into the mix, which adds all of the complexities you just described. Layered on top of that, as you discuss in your book, are certain technological changes as well, which adds another layer of complication that makes this moment particularly, precarious. Can we talk through a bit of those technological innovations? Obviously, artificial intelligence is the top of everyone's mind. What is the relationship between artificial intelligence and nuclear weapons?
Sure. I think that's a great question. I mean, just to talk about technology a little bit, right? Nuclear
Yeah,
weapons have existed in a world where technological change has been endemic. Technology has
yeah.
changed in the 50s, the 60s. I mean, the intercontinental ballistic missile, when that arrived on the scene in the late 1950s, that was a new technology
Mhm.
fundamentally. This idea that you could turn what used to be a hours long lurch to nuclear warfare with aerially delivered nuclear weapons on heavy bombers to something that would take 30 minutes when the United States and the Soviet Union got there. So technological change isn't new, but I think as you put it very rightly, you have many new domains of technological change that are now intersecting with nuclear weapons. AI is a really good one. I talk about AI quite a bit in the book. I was writing the book as global fascination with artificial intelligence exploded once
Mhm.
ChatGPT took off, in particular. But in a way, the nuclear world has been contending with these questions for a lot longer about the role that computers play in supporting human decision makers, in understanding the strategic environment, understanding, for instance, when an attack might be imminent, when an attack might be already occurring. Computers, statistical systems, machine learning systems have, in a way, long been integrated with nuclear systems. And of course, everybody's seen Terminator. That's a very
Yes.
familiar cultural touchstone for a lot of people. So, for a lot of folks in the public, hearing artificial intelligence and nuclear weapons in the same sentence is somewhat terrifying because it, I think, evokes the idea that it might be tempting for human beings to outsource decision making to computers. The good news is that's not where I see the big risk with AI. The fundamental question, the framework I present for thinking about technological change in the book, and I would apply this to AI. I would apply this to cyber capabilities, space weapons, advanced non-nuclear weapons of all kinds. Is what will technological change mean for the survivability of nuclear forces? And that's a little bit of a wonky turn of phrase, but let me explain what that means. Nuclear deterrence is at its most stable when the countries that possess nuclear weapons and rely on them for reasons of national defense and deterrence feel that they are survivable, which means that they cannot be easily destroyed by the other side, either with a nuclear attack or a non-nuclear attack. So let's say you're North Korea, right? You're a fairly small country, you have limited resources, you rely on your nuclear weapons. You don't want to live in a world where you think Washington is going to develop some kind of exquisite artificial intelligence system that's going to fuse all of the satellite imagery that we collect every day, and in a crisis or a war, tell the president of the United States with a very high degree of confidence that the US can find all of North Korea's nuclear weapons. Because if that can be done, that's incredibly destabilizing. It creates very strong incentives for the North Koreans to use their nuclear weapons first before they lose them. And it fundamentally destabilizes that condition of mutual vulnerability between nuclear possessors that maintain survivable forces. So this is the way I think about technology. In the book, I don't definitively answer this question, right? Because technology is changing perpetually. And particularly with AI systems, there's a fair degree of enthusiasm that these capabilities will render some of these military intelligence tasks, tactical and operational tasks that have long been either, depending on your perspective, intractable or extremely difficult, a lot more doable. And the other thing is that AI will permeate nuclear forces in a variety of ways. It will permeate nuclear command and control systems in ways that will potentially even help the survivability of nuclear forces, right? So not all technological change is bad, but again, the bottom line here is complexity. You have multipolar complexity, and on top of that, you have rapid technological change adding further complexity to the nuclear balance.
So I do want to ask you how we emerge from this new era intact, how, in the words of the subtitle of your book, how we don't, go over the precipice of Armageddon. But before we get there, are there any other elements of this new era that I haven't asked you about that you think are worth noting?
Yeah, so just two additions, right? So we talked a bit when we talked about the second nuclear age, that period in the 1990s, all of the advancements that we made in managing nuclear weapons from a global perspective, the global nuclear order, arms control. The late Michael Crapon described the period between 1987 and 2000 as the golden age of arms control. Unfortunately, what we now find ourselves in is a bit of a dark age, right? A lot of those arms control agreements and treaties have either crumbled, have either been unilaterally abrogated by some of their participants, or they're under tremendous amounts of strain today for reasons having to do with some of the dynamics we've talked about, including the great power discord. So that's one that I think is really important to understand. And of course, there are debates about how do you do arms control in this complex multipolar environment. There are many voices in the United States, for instance, today that don't think that the US can do arms control exclusively with Russia, because that leaves the China question unaddressed. I would argue, again, that's perhaps a little bit short-sighted, because the US still has a lot to gain from Russia. Russia presents a very different kind of nuclear threat, even if China is building up its forces. So that's one, the global nuclear order. The second is a little bit of an interesting issue, which is the role of the United States in particular. The book was finalized in 2024, before the American election in November. But of course, it didn't come at this from a point of particular optimism, which is that fundamentally, American allies, the U.S. extends its nuclear deterrence capabilities to more than 30 countries around the world. It's not an act of altruism. It's one of the strongest tools the U.S. actually has to keep these countries non-nuclear, right? We tell them that the United States would be willing to run the risk of nuclear war to defend these countries. That's an extremely difficult thing to do. It requires solutions with both hardware and software. The software is under quite a bit of strain for reasons having to do with essentially the United States now openly questioning whether allies are assets or liabilities in a way that we haven't really seen in the nuclear age. Again, I don't want to be ahistorical. We've had differences with our allies over the several decades that followed the arrival of the first nuclear age. But today, if the US turns its back on this enterprise of extended deterrence, of keeping allies non-nuclear as an inherent goal of American grand strategy, that is opening a very dangerous Pandora's box, in my opinion. So, all of the complexity we've talked about, it becomes a lot worse if nuclear weapons spread. You have more centers of nuclear decision making, more pathways to escalation. You talked about going off of the precipice. That becomes a lot easier when the number of decision-making centers around the use of nuclear weapons in the world potentially increase. So the book describes some of the reasons why the U.S. is no longer playing the role that it used to, but I think that is going to have very important long-term consequences.
So you just painted a really bleak picture, making the case for the subtitle at the Precipice of Armageddon. What sort of policy solutions or political solutions exist to help us avoid that worst case scenario today, given just how complex and multi-layered and multifaceted the nuclear threat is today? How do we emerge from this unscathed, or not as badly scathed as we could be?
Absolutely. No, look, I mean, my day job is to think about these terrible things, but also to think about how to not go to that place where we have to see nuclear weapons used or end up in a broader nuclear war, God forbid. And so the final chapter of the book does offer a set of prescriptions, a set of thoughts on how to think about this moment of precarity, of complexity. And the good news is, there are solutions. There are, of course, I'm not particularly worried on the technical side in terms of, how do you do arms control again? People like me who spend time at think tanks coming up with proposals have plenty of ideas. Of course, the problem today is that the political and diplomatic precursors to even get to the negotiating table don't exist, right? The US and Russia have, now they're in the middle of a odd kind of renormalization effort, but arms control negotiations between the two countries, particularly a bid to extend the New START treaty, which expires next year, which is the last thing limiting the size of the US and Russian strategic arsenals. There's been no serious effort to extend that, or it can't be extended again, but to come up with a new treaty to replace that. US-China arms control isn't taking place. But one of the closing thoughts I offer in the book is that there will be a compelling moment, I think, where self-interest for all of these countries will point in the direction, once again, of negotiated restraint. That is one of the precursors. That is one of the lessons we take away from the Cold War, is that arms control is not, again, an act of altruism towards your adversary. It's something you do out of your own self-interest. Even Donald Trump has talked about denuclearization, and he attributes a very traditional arms control rationale for why the U.S. should move towards arms control talks, which is that he thinks nuclear weapons cost a lot of money. That's true, right? The sensitivity to the costs of arms racing is a driver. But also, we might have a moment like the Cuban Missile Crisis where we get very close to the precipice. That was a catalyzing moment during the Cold War that I think showed Khrushchev and Kennedy and their successors why nuclear deterrence alone was simply too dangerous, that you needed to bound the risk that is inherent in that enterprise of deterrence. Now, look, I'm not counseling that we have a Cuban Missile Crisis, because the problem with that argument that I see is that you roll the dice on 100 Cuban Missile Crises, you come out alive probably, 30% of the time. I don't like those odds. But ultimately, the reason I wrote this book is, first of all, to argue, hopefully to people outside of the small community that I exist in, the world of nuclear weapons experts, that nuclear weapons are back at the forefront of statecraft, that as we live in this world of geopolitical flux in particular, decision makers, publics, national security establishments, diplomats in non-nuclear countries need to recognize these dangers. And so in a way, it's a call to arms to take these risks seriously, to preserve what we still have. At the end of the book, you'll see when you get there, talks quite a bit about the need to prevent nuclear testing. That's actually one of the most important, I think, things we could preserve. We have a very strong norm that we've built up over a number of years against the testing of nuclear weapons. The only country to have tested a nuclear weapon in the 21st century remains North Korea. I think it's really important that we keep it that way and we get the North Koreans to stop testing. So that's one concrete idea. And then, unfortunately, when I wrote the book, I ended with actually I end the book with an important sort of observation that I think should matter for particularly democratic publics, which is the leaders we elect. Because Like it or not, one of the things that's most terrifying about nuclear weaponry in particular is the ways in which nuclear weapons could be used are often subject to individual leaders, right? In the United States, we're a democracy for the moment, but when it comes to nuclear weapons and the authority to use nuclear weapons, it is only the president that can make that call. There is no obligation for the president to consult with the Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of State, the Speaker of the House, or anything like that. It is a decision that can be made by one person, and so it really matters who that person is. Of course, at this moment, I'm not sure many readers will feel particularly encouraged, but longer term, I think when you look at Kennedy's decision making, for instance, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, you really do see a person. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasts for 13 days. Kennedy is a different person on the 13th day than he was on day one of the crisis, and it's fundamentally this characteristic that I call prudence that I think really does shape the ways in which we should want our leaders to relate to nuclear capabilities and nuclear weapons and deterrence in general. So it's a bit of a philosophical take on the way to think about these issues. But again, in democracies where people do have the ability to choose their leaders and choose leaders who will have, I think, a say in these matters pertaining to existential and catastrophic risks for humanity, there is a need to think very carefully about how the leaders you choose are going to think about nuclear weapons and deterrence.
Well, Ankit, thank you so much. Again, the book is called The New Nuclear Age at the Precipice of Armageddon, available now. Thank you.
Thanks
It's great.
a lot.
It's a great book.
Appreciate it.
Strongly recommend everyone. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot. My pleasure.
All right. Thank you to Ankit Panda, and thank you for listening. We'll have more episodes that were recorded live at the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference. And as always, you can get notified of when we go live by becoming a subscriber at globaldispatches.org. See you next time. Bye.